Whatever I got. Yep. Got it to get that off. We have to go to the other machine to do it. But in any case, I'm Tony Cabon, Chairman of the Planning and Zoning Commission, calling this special meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission to order at 5:34 p.m. on April 14th, 2022. This is a hybrid meeting with some attendees being in person and some remote on Zoom. The meeting is being recorded. We have started the recording. Since we are in person, those of us who are here will do the Pledge of Allegiance and the rest can follow along as well. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Before we begin, I want to welcome Howard Craig to the commission. Howard is online tonight. He spent 10 years in the Navy as a sonoman. Then he came over to the dark side and became an officer for 11 years. He's currently director of submarine modernization training at the base. I also want to note that Captain Whitescarver has been promoted to voting member. And we have a new zoning enforcement officer, John Herring, who is not here, but will be later, I assume.
No, there's conflict.
Oh, there's conflict. Okay. So I'll note that we have a new zoning enforcement officer replacing the duly departed Mr. Cherry, who is nevertheless here. The record will note that in addition to Howard, Paul, and me, Marty Wood is present on Zoom. Katie Scanlon, Tom Boudreau, and Jim Ark are excused. We have one remaining vacant position on the commission. Howard Craig will be appointed as a voting member for this meeting. That means we will have 4 voting members. Also present are our staff, Juliet Hodge, town planner, and Nancy Woodlock, the land use assistant. This meeting is a workshop. The only item on the agenda is presentation and discussion of the draft housing plan, which has been prepared by our consultant. After the presentation is made, this is an informal meeting, so we will welcome anyone who wishes to make comments or ask questions. I would point out, however, that this is not a public hearing, and so this is not the time to debate the draft housing plan. It's time to present it. So
It's not quite the draft plan.
Yeah,
It's just a discussion.
it's the presentation of the plan. It is not the one that it could be modified. So the point is, we're not going to debate it. At this point, I would ask Juliet to introduce it, to explain the background of why we are here, why we must adopt a plan, and then introduce our consultant. So I'll let you say a few words.
Well, I'll probably leave it to the consultant, but we are mandated to do a housing plan every 5 years. This was a bill that came into effect in 2017. Basically, if you want to ever be qualified for funds related to housing projects, you would have to have a plan. We have hired John, correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. It's Tyke Associates, right?
Heike.
To help us with this plan, and commission members are also required to have some training in the, for the statute as well. And so I thought we'd have a little discussion about housing and maybe bring us up to date on where we are in the plan and the findings so far, and any discussion that or answer questions maybe that people have on the statute, and leave it to these folks.
All right, so we'll turn it over to John.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Juliet. I'm going to, what's the display setting? Swap. Okay, does that look like I'm doing a PowerPoint for you folks?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you very much. As Juliet said, I'm John Guskowski. I'm one of the principals of Tyke Planning and Policy Group. We specialize in Connecticut small town planning for the most part. And serve many communities in a staff capacity similar to what Juliet is doing for Ledyard. My colleagues and I are planning and zoning staff to around 13 or 14 different communities And so have had a broad set of experiences in seeing different development patterns and different concerns about growth and housing issues. I'm here this evening with my colleague Rachel Burstein, who will be doing a part of the presentation as well, and who has been working with me and Juliet in putting together this plan. As Juliet mentioned, there was a statute, Public Act 17170, which is now codified as Section 8-30J of the Connecticut General Statutes. This was passed in 2017 and requires every community every 5 years to either produce or update a plan of affordable housing. I have highlighted, this is on the screen is the entirety of the statute. It's a very short section, and really only the first paragraph and really only the last sentence of the first paragraph really describes what the purpose of this statute is. It basically just requires every municipality to come up with a plan to specify how the municipality intends to increase the number of affordable housing developments in the municipality, period. That's really it. And the second two paragraphs of the statute basically go through a little bit of process. Like if the community is going to hold a public hearing or information sessions, what do you have to do? But that's it. That's really the mandate is, hey, Ledyard, hey, every community in Connecticut, come up with a plan. And beyond that, it's really left to the community to direct how they act and how they sort of treat what affordable housing ought to look like in each community. So while it is a mandate and every community is basically required to adopt their first 5-year plan by June 1st, if they're unable to do it by June 1st, you just have to basically, in this last section, in the last section, you just have to write a letter to the Commissioner of Housing explaining why you haven't done it yet. But actually, fortunately, as Juliet mentioned, there is no actual financial implication to the town if you don't get it done by June 1st. They did not actually tie in the same penalty of not updating your plan of conservation and development, which could have financial penalties. That does not apply to affordable housing plans. And so if we can't get this done in Ledyard or in any other community by June 1st, we just need to write a letter to the state saying we're working on it, we'll be done soon. But again, it's very open-ended, and communities have sort of taken this in a number of directions. I mentioned just before I began that we work and have done plans with a number of communities around the state. I think we're probably up to around a dozen completed plans with 5 or 6 more in process. And communities, because the mandate is so broad and vague, communities take it in a bunch of different directions. It obviously is a mandate, so the communities can't say, no, we're not going to do this. But communities have taken different approaches. Some make it a broad-ranging, open-ended community conversation about values and how the community is going to define itself over the next half decade or decade. Others just basically want an action step. Give us 10 things that we need to do. Let's call it our plan. Let's move on. Others have basically said, listen, the state is saying we have to check this box. We'll produce a plan. We'll check the box. Let's move on, and are not, sort of taking it as an opportunity for a deep community conversation. But so this is really Ledyard's plan to take in the direction that it wants. When we talk about affordable housing, the statute that we're talking about does actually define affordable housing in the same way as it's defined in Section 8-30G, a couple of sections before this in the statute, as basically income limited and deed restricted lands, housing, I should say, that are either subject to CHFA or USDA mortgage assistance, are income restricted for a period of 40 years, or were adopted under incentive housing programs and are restricted, income restricted over 30 years. Government assisted, so like senior housing, disabled housing, is considered capital A, affordable per the statute. And then tenant rental assistance, which is sort of your traditional Section 8 vouchers. So those categories are the ones that count towards the state's bottom line And if a community does not have 10% of its housing stock defined as that capital A affordable, that municipality, and Ledyard is one of them, is subject to the Affordable Housing Appeals Act. And we can talk about that a little bit more later. But in coming up with an affordable housing plan, we very much encourage municipalities to not just focus entirely on those capital A affordable, those income, those legally income restricted properties, but also to take a look at what can the community do to encourage more what we call small A affordable or naturally occurring affordable housing. And these are just additional housing opportunities in town that might be an extra apartment above somebody's garage, or an accessory apartment in the backyard, or smaller residential rental units that might just happen to be below sort of median market rate, and sort of expands housing opportunities in the town. In either case, capital A or small A affordable, what we mean is these are opportunities for people to live in a community and not spend more than 30% of their annual income on housing costs. If you are spending more than 30% of your income on housing costs, and that's an all-in cost. If you're renting, it's rent plus heat plus hot water. If you're an owner, it would include mortgage, taxes, as well as utilities. And if you're spending more than that, you're considered housing cost burdened. And housing cost burden is a concern, because people are living above their means and will have less income for, or less disposable income for other essentials like transportation and food and medical care and education. And so an overall goal for affordable housing is expanding those opportunities at all, across the entire demographic spectrum, across all stages of the life cycle, where people can find housing that does not cost burden them and that they can afford spending less than 30% of their annual income. A lot of myths about affordable housing when people raise that prospect. Oh my goodness, affordable housing is coming to town. In Connecticut, the reality is much better than the fears and concerns. Some sort of relatively nearby examples. Down 395 and over 95 in Old Saybrook, they developed Ferry Crossing, which is 16 rental units that are all affordable, 100% affordable. A mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units, and it was designed specifically to fit that New England coastal context. So this is affordable housing. Similarly, up in Litchfield, a conversion of an old firehouse to a couple of rental apartments. One of them is fully accessible per ADA, and this was a community effort that was sort of a public-private partnership and was a redevelopment of an underutilized community facility. So this is affordable housing. Similarly, in Kent, this was a redevelopment that was some redevelopment and some new construction, 5 rental apartments initially, and they expanded it to add 5 more units, all affordable, all at lower income ranges, and built near the center of town. So it's walkable to the center of the little town of Kent. So this is affordable housing. This is what affordable housing looks like in Connecticut. Last example, this is one that I had a little something to do with. I have been the consulting planner for the town of Essex for a decade now. And this was an 830G. So this was 3 buildings, 52 units. 30% of them are set aside as affordable. The other 36, if my math is right, are market rate units. So 16 of them are affordable. And in a community that prides itself on its small town character, Essex considers itself the best small town in America. There was a lot of concern about this, but these were extraordinarily well received and extraordinarily popular. These were rented up in under a year. And the other interesting thing is when people raise concerns about affordable housing, they very frequently say, well, you add too many apartment units, you're going to flood our schools with children. This is just one anecdotal example, but in Essex, in this 52 units, 52 new apartment units, there's zero new kids to the school district. There's actually only 1 or 2 kids that live in this apartment complex right now. This is 1 and 2 bedrooms. And they were both moved from some other place in town. So there were no, 52 units, no new kids to the schools, which, for a town with shrinking population, that actually may not be a good thing. But it certainly dispels the myth that affordable housing, floods your school system. So this is also affordable housing in Connecticut. We wanted to talk a little bit about Public Act 2129, which was a related bill to some of the affordable housing discussions. And this is a bill that was passed last June that basically establishes state standards for accessory apartments, and basically says that in any residential zone where you allow single-family residences as of right, you should also allow accessory apartments as of right, with the idea being to increase residential densities and housing options in all communities in Connecticut in a relatively gentle way, without sort of compromising the fundamental, lower density residential character of the established residential pattern, and giving homeowners more flexibility. There is, however, in this bill, Public Act 2129, a 2-step opt-out process that municipalities need to act on before January 1st of next year, January 1st, 2023, should they choose to not accept the new state standards. And that would be public hearings by both the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Board of Selectmen or Town Council, and then supermajority votes for both. So if you had a circumstance, as we did actually in Essex, where some members of Planning and Zoning were a little bit skeptical of this new state standard, considered opting out. I'm not sure they had the votes on Planning and Zoning, but the Board of Selectmen, 3-person Board of Selectmen, made it very clear that they were not going to allow an opt-out vote. So the town decided instead to change its regulations to fit this new standard. And it's not a particularly onerous standard. We noted, we haven't done a very deep dive in your zoning regulations, but reviewing them, Ledyard's current accessory apartment or accessory dwelling unit regulations do allow a secondary unit, an accessory unit, as of right, per the state statute, in all purely residential zones, and in a couple of your design districts or your special districts. And I believe that the regulatory changes that Juliet is working through with you would complete that, and in any zone where you allow a single-family residence, would also allow for an accessory apartment as of right. And Juliet can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Ledyard is already somewhere between 80 and 90% there, and it would just require a slightly additional tweaking to comply fully with the state statute.
Allow them detached.
I'm sorry?
Only allow them attached at the moment.
Okay. All right. So the big difference between the state standard and the current town regulations would be the difference between an attached and a detached. And certainly detached would be, something like you see on the screen, an apartment above a garage, or a little cottage in the backyard, or something like that. So that's a conversation that Ledyard ought to have over basically the next 6 months or so. And I will turn this over a little bit to Rachel to talk about some of our initial findings about Ledyard.
Thanks. So in reviewing or putting together this plan, we do a pretty thorough review of demographic conditions in town, looking at like what the current population in Ledyard looks like right now, also looking at what future projections are telling us at the moment about the next 2 decades. And we also do look at housing stocks. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of our initial review of this. So in Ledyard, as of 2019 American Community Survey census data, the total population is about 14,700 people. The town has a median age of about 38. Some of the largest age groups in town happen to be younger adult, middle age groups, as well as the under 5 age group, indicating both the presence of younger families in town as well as more established families and empty nesters. In terms of race, 86% of the town is white, 5% is Asian, 3% Black or African American, 3% American Indian and Alaskan Native, and 4% of town is 2 or more races. The median income in town is about $94,000 a year. About 4% of the population lives below the poverty level, which is a measure that the census uses, and this represents about 585 households. So the average household size in town has been declining. This is pretty common in neighboring towns and in Connecticut in general. In 2000, the average household size in Ledyard was 2.78, and now it's about 2.55. Reflecting this is the fact that over 60% of Ledyard households are made up of only 1 or 2 people. Over 60% of the population is married couple families. So you can imagine a lot of these are likely just empty nesters or just people without children. 33% of households live with 1 or more people under 18, once again showing us that there's a lot of families in town, but still over 1/5 of households live alone, so there's a mix. Oh, I don't know why my graph disappeared. Oh, there it is. Okay. So Ledyard's population has been on the decline for the last 10 years and is projected that this decline is going to continue. A 9% decrease is expected between 2020 and 2040. I think if you press the space bar again, it shows you the second graph. Oh yeah. Breaking this down in terms of age cohorts, it's really helpful for seeing if there's any specific group in town that's growing really rapidly. But in Ledyard, it looks like most age cohorts are pretty much staying the same. There's a very small increase in the 65+ age group in the next 20 years, likely from that large middle-aged group aging into their 65+ cohort. So in terms of takeaways on the population, we found that, like I said, Ledyard is expecting a continuing population decline. There's not really one age group that is projected to grow a lot in the next 2 decades or shrink. But this small growth of the elderly population of town might create maybe a need for more assisted living or smaller houses, 1-story houses, those suitable living arrangements for older folks. And most residents live in small 1 or 2 person households. Looking at the housing stock, in Ledyard, there are about 6,300 total housing units. The vast majority of these are single family detached units, although there are some 3 or 4 unit units. There's also about 4% mobile homes, so there are some. And most housing units, about 80% have 3 or more bedrooms. So you can see that there's really a mismatch between these larger family homes that have a lot of bedrooms and household sizes in town. The vast majority of houses are owner occupied. About 17% are renter occupied. There's vacancy rate just under 10%. And half of the housing stock in Ledyard was built before 1970, and it's considered aging. So it's at risk for higher costs of keeping up with repairs and maintenance. There's health risks associated with it too. There's been a pretty slow pace of development in Ledyard the last 20 years compared to prior to 2000, the year 2000. You can see it peaks in about 2003 at 83 permits. Since then, there's been just a real decline in development. This is specifically for housing. And in 2013, there's a small bump, but it's pretty much been plateauing at like in the teens for the permitting. In terms of what housing tends to cost in Ledyard, the median rents seem pretty stable. They've kind of just been on a plateau for the last 10 years or so. Home values in Ledyard have been decreasing for the last 10 years, but no huge drops or spikes at any point. So housing takeaways, development's been pretty slow in town. Housing tends to be less expensive. Home values are on the decline. Single family homes still dominate the housing market in Ledyard. Houses are typically larger 3 or more bedroom homes, and less of them are 1 or 2 bedroom. And half the housing stock is considered aging. John talked a little bit about this, but in terms of affordable housing, Ledyard has about 4.56% affordable housing. And these are almost entirely through USDA, CHFA, single family mortgages. Very few are through tenant rental assistance and through government assistance, and there are no deed restricted units.
Update that info for you because that's not correct.
Yeah, I know the 2021 like just came out, so we would definitely be updating this.
I gave them the info.
Out of curiosity, Juliet, what's the change?
We have 6 deed restricted units.
6, was that an 830G approval?
There was 30 Gs, yeah. Yeah, they all were, yeah. They just, none of them got to the state for some reason. I'm not sure what happened, but I sent all that info out. And our number of new houses has also dramatically increased again. We're back up to in the 20s and 30s, so.
Right, so yeah, so that I think the last date we had that information was for 2020. So yeah, certainly you have, you know, a year and a half of update to do there.
Cool.
Yeah, there was a big uptick.
Yeah, we'll be adding that in. In terms of affordability in town, a pretty common measure is, as John said, cost burden, which is when a household is paying 30% or more of their annual income for housing, which includes your rent or mortgage plus your utilities. In Ledyard, 24% of households are burdened by the cost of housing. When we break this down between renters and owners, renters are a little bit more likely to be cost burdened than owners. 32% of renters are cost burdened, whereas 22% of owners are cost burdened. So takeaways, Ledyard is not exempt from the affordable housing appeals process because that 4.5% number does still fall below the 10% threshold for the state. The vast majority of the current affordable units in town are single family mortgages through the USDA or CHFA. And there's very few affordable rental units in town. Nearly a quarter of residents are burdened by housing costs, and these tend to be higher for renters and for owners. I'll pass it back to John for next steps.
So yeah, as we said, we are not completed with the plan yet. We've basically gone through you know, the existing demographic information and housing profile. Obviously, as Juliet noted, well, there's a couple of years that we need to add to the analysis. The next 2 sections that we're going to be working on in terms of developing this plan is first completing our analysis of your plans and regulations, specifically the town's plan of conservation and development, and primarily the zoning regulations, because this is sort of the way in which the community has the most impact from a regulatory standpoint on how housing gets developed, how difficult it is, how much you can develop it is, how expensive it costs, what the densities are, and where in town. So we'll be assessing your zoning regulations as well as your proposed zoning regulations, because again, I know that you guys are in process of doing some updates. And we'll assess them in terms of how they impact the development of housing opportunities. And then again, working primarily through Juliet, and perhaps with this commission as well, we'll be developing a list of goals and action items, and that will be really the crux of the plan, which again we hope will come together in the next month and a half. And we'll sort of break down the goals and action items into a couple of different areas. One, certainly being regulatory change. Are there areas where we can, make some tweaks in terms of density or permitting processes or allowable uses that would make it easier to create wider housing opportunities in town? Certainly some administrative steps, could the town do a little bit more in terms of outreach to realtors, to lenders, to homeowners, to let them know about CHFA and USDA programs or financing programs that would make housing a little bit more affordable, to work with potential developers. And then the third category of action steps would be actual investments. Is the town interested in setting aside money, whether it's through inclusionary zoning fees for new applications or actual municipal funds into a housing trust fund or to be a partner in a development. And so we'll take a look at those three broad categories of goals and action items, and come up with a plan for the town's consideration. And again, looking at doing this over the next month and a half. And with that, I'll stop for now, and happy to answer questions. Again, so this is not a completed plan. This was intended to be a little bit of a background of what we've been asked by the state to do, and a little bit about where Ledyard stands right now, with the goal next being, identifying those areas where Ledyard can kind of move forward.
All right,
Back to you,
comments-
Mr. Chairman.
Comments or questions?
Yeah, so I guess the first question for me is this Ledyard doing this, or is this the state? I'm kind of confused. Hired the consultant to do this.
It's a, oh, Juliet, do you want to answer that?
It was a grant that we, applied for to have a consultant help us with the plan.
Okay,
This is us.
Yeah.
this
Yeah,
is
this is
us.
us. This isn't the state, right?
I guess the second question is, your data, what I find is that all the data that we pull from today is, limited to ending in 2019 or 2000 or 2000, 2020. And it doesn't take into consideration
The pandemic.
the pandemic, right? So it kind of, and I don't mean this in a derogatory or a negative thing for you. It's just, me and my job, I struggle with how do you pull data to make it useful when most of the data sets that you pull from are not considering the pandemic in it.
Right. And then where's the 2020 census data? Is it all out? I mean, why do we keep seeing 2019?
Yeah, no, it's not. The 2020 census, the decennial census, has only released data on 100% population counts right now. The census is actually a relatively short form and does not include housing characteristics, housing costs, and a lot of the other analytical demographics that we get from the American Community Survey. So whereas yes, we do have some population data from the 2020 census, the housing data, basically the census housing data, is only current through 2019. So we grant that it's a couple of years old, but we further grant that it's the best available data that we've got. It's true that it doesn't include the pandemic, and when we draft the plan and draft the recommendations, we certainly take that into account. But what is not clear at this point is what, if anything, are the long-term ramifications of the pandemic to Ledyard's or Connecticut's housing market. It's really too early to tell if it's just a year and a half or 2-year blip in housing starts and increased sort of out migration from New York and Boston and in migration into Connecticut, or if it's you know, the start of something much more significant. That's the challenge of writing a plan at a point in time, is that, you know, you're trying to drop a pin on a moving target, you know. And so, you know, we do not make recommendations with the thought that this data is 1000% accurate and unchanging and unerring. You know, we take data for what it is, and it's, you know, it's margin of error and the fact that things are changing. And we try to make recommendations that address, you know, sort of broader, clearer trends.
Will we be doing a housing needs survey? I can't remember if that was in the RFP.
Like a community survey or like a gap analysis.
I guess either, but you know, to figure out what people want.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had it as an option. I'm not sure if it was a mandatory thing, but I think our proposal included an optional survey. And if that's what the community would like to do, we can certainly help you put out a survey to get community input and assessment of needs. Certainly.
Gap analysis would be easy.
Gap analysis is basically, we have all the data. It's basically, we have the housing data, housing cost data, we have the income data. It's basically just sort of matching those things up.
John, if I could, Mike Chair, I noticed Public Act 2129 repealed section 830J and replaced it with a separate paragraph that doesn't seem to do too much, but there's some new words in there.
It does. I think that's the slide I may have had. I think they switched it over to Office of Policy and Management, perhaps, instead of the Department of Housing as the implementing agency.
Yeah.
And then the other thing it did is that it codified the use of the phrase affordable housing to follow the definitions of 830G. So when 830J says affordable housing, it's using that same 830G definition.
If I understand Rachel's slides, it appears our biggest needs going forward from your first look are for assisted living and aging in place or age appropriate housing and more rental housing to try and reduce that more than 30% housing burden that we see. Is that a fair assessment?
Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say so. And also just like housing types in general that suit smaller families, because that seems to be a pretty consistent thing. People are in those 1 or 2 person households as opposed to larger households. So, yep.
We can't get guys like me to move out of that 4-bedroom house because there isn't a 2-bedroom.
And so, I mean, yeah, creating those opportunities for, you know, not just sort of senior, like assisted type stuff, but empty nester downsizer options where you do have, you know, small cottage clusters or small condo communities of, you know, 1 and 2 bedroom units, or, you know, 2-3 bedroom units if they want to have, you know, spots for the grandkids to come visit. But basically smaller single family ownership housing is there's a big gap there.
And all we see getting built are still the 4-bedroom houses,
Yeah.
every single one of them. And that, I mean, when you try to say, hey, come on,
Pushing
throw a couple
$500,000,
2-bedroom
yeah.
duplexes in there. No go. Crazy, but anyway.
I have a couple of comments. One is that there are really 2 population groups that we need to be aiming our housing policies at. Certainly, one group are the people that are already here. And that's the group we've been talking about, where we need more assisted living, we need more housing for the elderly. We need more affordable units for the people who are already in town. But then we, as a town, we need to address the fact that our population is declining or at best remaining stable. And if we want to grow business in this town, we need to bring people to the town. And so we need to look at what's the population we would like to attract and what are the housing needs of those kinds of people. And if we go back to 1970, the average age at first marriage for men was 23. The average age at first marriage for women was 20. The average age at first child for married women was 24. And so back in 1970, the people looking for housing were by and large young married couples about to start families. Today, it's very different. I don't want to use the pandemic year because in the pandemic year, average age of marriage went up even more. But if we go back to 2019, which is the most recent year for which we have pre-pandemic data, average age at first marriage for men was 30. Average age at first marriage for women was 28. Average age at first baby for married women was 32. And so we have there's a whole population out there of young adults who are graduating from high school, graduating from college, who are going to be looking for housing. And they're not looking for 4-bedroom houses. They're starting out. Electric Boat is going to be hiring some 15,000 people. I don't know how many are going to be here. Some are going to be over across the pond there, but they're going to be young adults, and we don't have a lot of housing for those people. They're looking for apartments. They're looking for other kinds of affordable units. They're the kind of people we'd like to get to come to town, because if we can get them to come to town, maybe 7, 8, 9 years from now, when they get married, if they like the town, they're going to want to stay here. And that's when they're going to want to be looking at the kind of housing we have available now. And we don't have housing that's going to attract the kinds of people that are going to be looking for housing. And until we start providing that kind of housing, we're not going to be able to grow our population. And if we can't grow, or at least keep our population stable, we're not going to be able to have economic development. So I think the plan has to address not only what do we do for the people who are here, but what do we do to try to bring the people to this town that we want to bring to this town? And they're two different populations.
Mr. Chairman, I think Eric Treaster had his hand up earlier.
Sure. Sorry, Eric, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. That's good. I'm learning a lot tonight, and I really appreciate it. Couple of simple questions. The 30% income that goes towards housing, that's mortgage payments and everything. Does that also utilities? Does that also include property taxes?
Yes, for the ownership number, yes, it does.
Okay, so the town's tax rate has a significant influence on that 30% number, as far as affordability is concerned. Second question is that for some reason, which I do not understand, very few towns are urging zoning regulations to allow well-designed land lease communities or well-designed mobile home parks. And I was wondering if that could be put on the agenda for at least a discussion in Ledyard at an appropriate time. I'm a firm believer that land lease communities offer the benefits of home ownership as well as the benefits of renting. It's the best of both worlds. And I'd like to see it at least discussed. The third question is, I don't fully understand if we're losing population, that seems like it would be freeing up housing units. And if we're freeing up housing units, that means that we have competition, which means the rent should be stable or maybe even dropping. So if you could discuss on that just a little bit, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. Well, yeah, so to the third point, population has been declining and is projected by the Connecticut State Data Center to continue to decline. However, as Rachel pointed out, median household sizes are also declining. So in these 3-4 bedroom houses that Mike and others in town live in, used to live in with their kids, now basically live in alone or with a spouse. And so, that's the stock of housing units are not being freed up at the same rate.
And divorce rate is up, but I mean, a lot of people are not getting married or have divorced. So you essentially double the need for housing in a town, and you may not have changed your population at all.
So that, yeah. Was that the entirety of that question, or I thought there was maybe a second part of it?
That was the most important one.
Okay.
Thank you.
If I could go back once again, Jessica, you had error bars on a lot of your data. And Paul had a question on the effect of the pandemic. if we look over a longer period of time, could we say the pandemic is a 1 or 2 year blip that's gonna go away and we're gonna continue that same trend, or is that forecasting too much in the future?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Rachel, you may have a different opinion. I tend to think of it as the major impact being a relatively short-term blip. I do think that there are going to be some long-term tweaks, but I think, to a certain extent they would reinforce maybe longer-term trends, where people are, well, I don't know. I think some of the trends, I think we're seeing a minor impact where communities that are sort of perceived as really lovely bedroom communities are upticking slightly in popularity, where there's good data, where there's good broadband, because people are more willing to work from home if it's, number one, if they live in a really nice place, and number two, if they can't work from home. There's a lot of portions of Connecticut, particularly rural Connecticut, where that second portion is really not available. There's some gorgeous communities in Eastern Connecticut where lots of people would love to work from home, but there's just not the broadband. So I may have taken your question as an opportunity to get on a different hobby horse of mine, but it's complicated, I think, is the bottom line, and we don't really know. I do not think that the pandemic changed the game for Connecticut towns. I don't think it did, but I do think there are some longer term, so it's like somewhat bending the trajectory, but I don't think that your trajectory was broken by 90 degrees or anything like that.
Do you think that the pandemic influence, I always thought that the pandemic may affect, people wanting to have more accessory apartments so that their loved ones can, move in with them to help with childcare? I mean, we learned that we needed to depend on other people. We learned that we needed space to have to be able to work at home and not kill your spouse at the same time if you were both working from home, and a place to get your kids to do their school from home. So, I mean, I felt like that kind of, that maybe the 3-bedroom houses might become popular again because you needed that space to work from home or move a relative in or move a roommate in. So I'm curious to see if that is a thing, or if that happens or is sustained.
Yeah, I think that I don't think we have really good sort of comprehensive analysis of that data. I would tend to agree with that. But I think, unfortunately, as we've seen, with Ledyard is a little bit ahead of the game in terms of accessory apartments, but at least in Connecticut, the great majority of communities did not allow, and are sort of struggling with the issue right now about allowing accessory apartments as of right. And so, when the pandemic hit and people, relatives are moving back home, or is in a lot of towns, it was that was not really an easy option. And so now, 2 years in, a lot of towns are starting to think about accessory apartments, largely because of Public Act 2129. But I think those two things sort of happened coincidentally and not sort of one causing the other. So I think it's going to be another year or two before we see the numbers on that.
I mean, we changed our regulations in 2018 from in-law apartments to accessory apartments, took away the family requirement. And since 2018 to date, we've had 4 permits for accessory apartments. They had to be attached, but it's not like people were beating down the door. It's just, we sat there and said, okay, if I build an in-law apartment, what happens when my in-law doesn't want to live here anymore or passes? What do I do with it? I can't meet zoning anymore. Do I get a chainsaw and cut it down? And we said, well, that's stupid. But there was no rush for in-law apartments, and I don't know that there'd be a big rush if we said detached were allowed. We didn't do detached before because as a commission, we couldn't figure out how to do the infrastructure without costing a fortune. Well, the legislature has helped us with that. So, that took out our biggest complaint.
Right. Well, the other, I mean, the other element of that is, obviously the folks on the Zoom call and the folks in the room there are amongst the I would say very few or very small percentage in town who understand what zoning is and understand what, the change you made in 2018, what that really meant. I would guess, and I might even wager, that if you asked, 100 residents in town, what the process is for getting an accessory apartment,
They have no idea.
75% of them would have no idea. So
50%.
Yeah.
it's one thing to change the regulation. It's quite another, and to give you a sneak preview of some of our recommendations, it's quite another to actively educate the public and homeowners on what their new rights are.
Well, I think expectations need to change too. I grew up in a 3-bedroom home with 3 siblings. So there were 6 of us, and then my grandmother moved in, there were 7 of us. We had plenty of room. We had a living room, a dining room, a kitchen, 3 bedrooms. What more could you ask for? I could cut the lawn in a half hour. I could shovel the 3 feet of snow in Chicago in about an hour out of the driveway because it wasn't 150 feet long. And I think today's generation, just looking at my daughter trying to buy their first home, they're priced out of the market because everybody's building these $450,000, $500,000 homes. And for a first-time homeowner, unless you're a relative of who's the guy buying Twitter, Elon Musk,
Right.
Or unless you can have a roommate.
Yeah. You're priced out of the market. So, looking forward to your recommendations, John.
And I thought it's also interesting that the Quakertown Meadows here, our subdivisions, the Peter Gardner subdivision are very dense. Their houses
Well,
are
they
on
are.
top of each other, but
They sold
some people like
immediately.
them. They don't want to deal with the yard. I mean, one of my trainers at the gym, he's like, oh, I love it. The neighbor's right there. I don't have a yard to deal with. My driveway's short and it's nice.
I'm out checking monuments in that subdivision, and I swear I'm standing in the next home's front yard looking for the monument, but it looks very comfortable. I mean, you get to know your neighbors. How many of us don't even know the names of our neighbors? Speaking of neighbors, I see Jessica's. hand
Yes,
up.
I see Jessica's hand up. Go ahead.
Sorry, I thought about this when you brought up the Quakertown Meadows subdivision, and this is something that I think we need to talk about when we talk about aging in place and planning for our older residents. Even if we have older residents who might want a 3-bedroom house, my parents have been looking to move to Connecticut because they like me that much to deal with that. But they cannot find a builder who's building a subdivision of colonials who will put in a 1-story house. Everyone wants a colonial with 2 stories. So that's just kind of another big deal when we look at housing and long-term plans, is making sure that when we are creating housing, people can age in. It doesn't need to be a 4-bedroom, 2-story house. It can be a 1-story house in that neighborhood, and something maybe we can work into long-term neighborhood plans when we're developing that. Thank you. Sorry, I just had to say it.
That's a diversity I had never thought of.
Hey, so question, so how many municipalities of the 169 meet the 10% requirement for affordable housing?
I'm guessing I think it's around 3 dozen.
I'm gonna guess about 40.
But those are our bigger communities though, too, with infrastructure. But,
Yeah.
New
Locally,
London.
New London, Norwich, Groton. Well, yeah, Wyndham, and then you go up 395, Putnam, Plainfield, Killingly.
Yeah, I do have one more comment on the effects of the pandemic. It's interesting that one of the effect of the pandemic is that it affected the people at the high end of the spectrum and low end of the spectrum very differently. The people upper middle class and upper class saw their income rise considerably during the pandemic. Working class and lower saw their income decline, and so we end up with this interesting phenomenon where there's been an increase in demand for high-priced housing because people have the money to buy the high-priced housing. So in Ledyard, if we look at what's happening to housing prices, they've just gone through the roof. There's one that just sold on Esca down from me It's a colonial or Tudor, two-story. It went for 485. It's a nice house. It's not a $500,000 house. You know which one it is. It's 13.
Probably built for the high two.
Yeah, it was built for the high twos. On the other hand, though, there are a lot of people who were hurt by the pandemic, and they're having trouble finding affordable housing. And so there are going to be long-term effects at both ends, I believe. Yes, it's going to be a blip, but I think it's going to take a while for that blip to work its way through. It's going to take a while for the people at the lower end of the spectrum to, even though unemployment down to 3%, 3.5%, the kinds of jobs they're getting now aren't the kinds of jobs they lost. And so we're going to see this continuing gap between the rich and poor in this country, and the poorer people in Ledyard and other places are going to need affordable housing.
I could, once again, John, can I take you a little bit out of your charter? 2129 makes housing a regional issue, it appears, where it used to say we ought to consider the region. They beefed up the words. And there's a bill in front of the House this term, 5204, titled An Act Concerning the Needs Assessment and Fair Share Plans for Municipalities to Increase Affordable Housing, and it's capital A affordable housing. Will our plan look at the region at all?
The short answer is no, probably not that much. Just because this mandate, 830J really is a local plan, and insofar as municipalities are still in charge of their own local policies relative to land use and largely financing. The scope of this plan is really to sort of look at Ledyard. I believe the changes in 2129 really had municipalities when they look at their plan of conservation and development and maybe even the zoning regulations are asked to consider the need for housing on a regional basis. I think to a certain extent that's a little bit aspirational, particularly where municipalities don't really have a true financial incentive to cooperate that much regionally. Certainly, tax sharing and things like that is not a reality yet. So, the long answer to the very short question is probably not. Is we're going to primarily focus on Ledyard policy because that's who's adopting this plan. I think I will say that in some communities that we're working with, and particularly small towns that are sort of in a cluster, and I'm referring specifically in this case to the little towns of Essex, Chester, and Deep River on the Connecticut River, are sort of all thinking a little bit more regionally, particularly when it comes to maybe a regional housing authority or regional housing committees, because I think that sort of the geography and development pattern sort of suits it. So maybe I'm talking myself back around to possibly considering it if there was appetite and inclination in town to think about these things a little bit more regionally. But the charge of 830J is the town.
The Council of Governments just did a regional thing too. We can just put in the appendix what their findings were at the very least.
Sure.
My question is about another aspect of the population that I'm not sure that you've considered. Are you going to look into the transient characteristic of the Ledyard population? Because we are right next to the sub base. We have a lot of population that comes and goes. And so I think that's one of the a consideration that makes Ledyard a little bit different than other towns in, say across the state. So I just think it's an aspect that gets overlooked a lot because the military population doesn't tend to come and speak at meetings and, you know, stuff like that. So I just want to make sure that that is in mind when we think about the kind of housing that we need to make available here in town.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, yeah, I think part of the challenge there, I think that's an important thing to recognize, and I don't know if we made that big a deal of it when we were going through the demographics, but Ledyard population profile is significantly younger than a lot of its peer communities around Connecticut, and I think that I think Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong, it was probably the 25 to 40 demographic is somewhat larger as a percentage of Ledyard than a lot of a lot of the other communities we work with, and I think that is a direct reflection of the sub base and that demographic of younger military folks. I think that we would include that in our analysis, and I do think we need to think about that reality and what sort of housing is available to them. And I think smaller housing although some military certainly have growing families, but also housing that could be conducive to being a little bit more transitory for people to live here for 1, 2, 3 years at a time, and that a lot of that is rental, and which doesn't exist in large numbers in Ledyard.
It's not just Ledyard, it's the whole region.
Sure. Yeah, I know. I mean, I know Groton struggles with this as well, and Stonington. Yeah.
If a young Navy family moves into the area, and let's say they're on their first enlistment or their first term, they're probably priced out of the ownership market, and the rentals are few and far between.
And affordable housing doesn't work, the deed restricted.
No.
It doesn't work because the value could wildly fluctuate by the time, from when you bought it to when you can sell it and you lose money.
So does the private public venture, does Belfour B, Ledyard does have a section of that is in Ledyard? Did you count that as?
The what?
No, we didn't.
Is it?
Yeah,
what?
it
I
is.
didn't hear
It
it.
is.
So private public venture, which is Belfour B, there are,
Belfour.
I want to say,
Ohio.
100 to 200 units that are in Ledyard.
Trident housing.
Okay.
Used to be more when there was on-base housing, but that's gone.
Yeah, so Mark Offinger was telling me in Groton, they didn't, because they don't include that in the Groton number, your affordable housing percentage goes down.
Yeah.
Even though it's affordable housing.
And
because the
it's
sale
government
are-
assisted, right?
And it's assisted, yeah. Well, even for the public, if they get in, it's
That's
assisted.
right. We don't, the base doesn't, Belfour B, who runs it, does not have, the Navy doesn't fill all their units, so they
Yeah.
can rent to the public, but it's at market rate. I don't know how that number works, but
It's lower than other market rates though, somehow. I don't know, 'cause I have friends that live there that are not military.
I also noticed in the data, the Latino population wasn't accounted for. Did I just,
Let's see.
I was personally curious, since that's the only other language I speak, so. Should I start beefing up my?
Rachel, do we?
Like on the census.
I don't think
they
did we? I don't know if we did we go through the?
A race.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
That normally the race says white and then they break it down later to
White,
white,
non-Hispanic.
non-Hispanic or Hispanic.
Mhm.
So it may be a result of how the data is taken.
Yeah, there's definitely like more detailed data that we'll include. That's very important.
That's usually a higher percentage.
Yeah.
Does give that. And they all fall into 2 or more races as well.
so how does the exemption work with the state?
So the 830G exemption is if your capital A affordable number goes over 10% of the total housing units, then you are no longer subject to the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, which is basically a tool that developers can use to put in higher density with a percentage of affordable units in places where it would not normally be allowed by zoning. So this law has been on the books for over 30 years, 830G. And it's not a requirement. It again, it's just a threshold, across which you are subject and across which you are not subject. And until apparently relatively recently, well, I don't know. I mean, again, Ledyard hadn't accounted for some of its 830G units, but Juliet, apparently there have been a couple. Again, but not that many. If we're talking a total of what, 6 units or something like that, in the 30 years of this law.
Well, there could have been a lot more at one point.
I
Yeah.
remember Inchcliffe, Ledyard Lane, Flatbrook,
That's it.
and that's pretty much hold your breath. But, John, there's the other way to look at 830G. 830G establishes a bright line that if you're below it, your zoning doesn't count. And as long as it meets general concerns for safety and such, you should approve it if the concerns are less than the need for housing. And when we talk about housing in southeastern Connecticut, I would say any planning and zoning commission is hard pressed to win any appeal unless they have strong safety and health issues. I look at 830G as another tool in the tool bag to get a development that we really want without having to rewrite our whole zoning regulation.
Yeah, I think actually a lot of communities have sort of not, despised and shied away from 830G, as I think, it's hit some communities, particularly in Lower Fairfield County, your Milfords, your Fairfield, Norwalk, Westport. But in lesser populated and slightly quieter housing markets, I think a lot of communities have sort of seen that as a useful tool to do, to sort of not have to overhaul your regulations and allow for some of these developments in certain areas.
We're almost negotiating what it'll look like where you can't do that with normal zoning regs.
Right. I mean, there is incentive housing that was created about a decade ago, but a lot of communities haven't really taken advantage of that.
Well, there's
No
no
more
funding.
incentives.
Right.
There's
Well,
no
yeah.
funding.
The incentive has sort of it's not financial anymore. It's more, permitting pathway is a little bit easier. But yeah, you're right.
Took away our incentive. Yeah, we were early on, we got money to help rewrite some stuff. By the time we had it rewritten, the money was
Right.
gone.
Same thing happened in North Barrington, exactly.
Are there any other questions or comments this evening? If not, we thank you for the presentation. We're looking forward to the next stage of this, next step in this. And
Is the presentation going to end up online attached to the minutes?
We can, Juliet, if we can send you a copy if you want.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, allows us to better formulate our
right,
questions for next time and talk to our neighbors who didn't come.
And to the commission members that weren't able to be here.
Yeah.
Yep, happy to do it. Thanks for the time, everyone.
thank you.
All right, thank you.
Anyone else have any questions or comments? If not, the meeting is adjourned at 6:43 p.m. and we will reconvene at 7 p.m. for the regular meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you.
You know.